Right. This is about the use of data, personal data, for marketing purposes. Primarily, it's for business to consumer, but I will throw a little bit in the end about business to business, because that's the that's a slightly easier, the slightly easier way. And so my intended outcome for today is to help you understand how you should be processing personal data when it's used for direct marketing in the B2C arena. And why would you want to do this? Well, it's because of these things. You want to avoid acquiring ex-customers. In other words, don't mess them about. Don't get them irate. Avoid wasting time with complaints. Avoid getting a bad name, and obviously to get it right as well, to give the impression that you know what you're doing. There we are. There's the reason why you want to do it, because you don't want to get caught out, really. And the three most bits of legislation are the GDPR, the UK version, the PECR, the Privacy Electronic Communication Regulation. That's the one that's 19 years old now, and that still applies even if you don't know who you're sending it to. And also the Data Protection Act 2018, which underpins everything else. What is marketing? Always useful to know. What is marketing? From a formal point of view, well, from an informal point of view, you might just say that it's just a message designed to change your behaviour. The ICO have provided guidance. Guidance is not the law, but it's still not a bad thing to use. And all that says is direct marketing covers the promotion of aims and ideals, as well as the sales of products and services. This means that the rules will cover not only commercial organisations, but also not-for-profit organisations such as charities or political parties. So the point is, it's not just about products and services, it's wider than that. And but I will say is that we're expecting a new code of conduct from the ICOs maybe this year, which may change some of those characteristics, especially around political parties campaigning. What is not marketing, I think, is also helpful to know, so that you can go ahead and do it anyway. When you're thanking someone or acknowledging something, some service, when you're simply issuing reminders, you might get a reminder from your local dentist, for example, or doctor to turn up the following day. For market research, where you probably want to use legitimate interests, customer satisfaction surveys, and information that you are obliged to provide, assuming that you've got a reason why you have to provide it in the first place. So those aren't marketing, because you're not actively seeking more products and sales. They are simply in passing type of affair. And when it comes to what can you do, everything has to have a lawful basis when you're using personal data. And the only two you can really use for marketing are consent and legitimate interest, when you're pursuing your legitimate interest. And I'll break those down a little bit further. Now, consent is the GDPR standard. In other words, it's higher than it was pre-GDPR. It must be unambiguous, freely given, specific, informed, and demonstrable. So freely given, that means no pre-ticked boxes. It must be an affirmative action by the data subject. And that can be a verbal yes, it can be a tick in the box or a wet signature, something along those lines. So that's consent, and it's quite a high bar, and you must be very clear as to the question that must be asked before to get someone's consent. Remember, it must be unambiguous. Now, legitimate interest, that's another of those lawful bases that you can use, but you need to understand what your legitimate interest is. You need to state it. So, for example, a legitimate interest might be, I want to get the best, my company wants to get the best candidates for a future job. So can anybody name a legitimate interest from their point of view that applies to their company? And sort of unmute and have a go.
It's silence.
So you must have a legitimate interest in your business to make it work. You may not have written it down, but you all have legitimate interests.
So something like at Box Group, so we provide COVID testing and screening for broadcast companies, which they have to do. Is that something that we would deem to be a legitimate interest if we sent that?
Yeah, so the legitimate interest in this case is acquiring data for a specific purpose, isn't it? And
yeah.
that's a statement. Or it could be a legitimate interest is you want to make money, you want to make a profit, which is a legitimate interest as well.
Okay. Right.
So the point is that you need to understand what your legitimate interests are, because if that's why you're marketing, then you have to bear that in mind clearly. And you will also need to understand is, well, who are you marketing to? You need to assess the market in some way. And there's a couple of other points just to raise here is there is something known as a soft in option, which may apply, and I'll talk about that later. And also, if you are marketing, if you are sending out newsletters and things, you must always give the option to opt out. More of that later. But these are very basic things. And as I say, the ICO is quite keen on following up complaints from the public when they feel that they've been marketed to and they weren't expecting it either. So in all of this, the approach is the approach is really important to understand what is the starting point between you and the person you want to market to. What is that relationship? Does it exist at all? Or is it based on some previous interactivity you've had with that person, either a meeting or even maybe a sale? So, business card exchange. That's quite often the starting point for a business making connectivities. So, what does it allow you to do? Well, in a business card exchange, all you're doing is exchanging personal data, voluntarily. There was a lot of fuss in the GDPR, around GDPR came in about whether you need to have a privacy notice for exchanging business cards. Load of rubbish, absolute rubbish. It's simply an exchange of information by mutual agreements, and all it does, it just builds a bridge between you and the other person. Because if all you've done is to have a chat, exchange business cards, all you've done is exchange business card, the details, and it allows you then to create a platform or a bridge between the two parties to take the conversation further, normally somewhere else. And that's it. It is not an invitation to be bombarded by lots of marketing material, unless the conversation has included the question, is it okay if I bombard you with marketing material? If you say yes, then there are, you've got consent. But that doesn't tend to happen. So all the business card exchanges is just to build a bridge in a business relationship. What about new customers? Well, a new customer comes into a store or whatever, they purchase something, and you may well get their details as a result of that purchase. You have entered into a commercial relationship. So if you want to reach out to them in the future, you don't need their consent, actually. You can use legitimate interests as a reason for reaching out to them using the soft opt-in. And but before you go down that line, you must at least assess the situation. You can't blindly say, right, I know this person now. We've got a relationship. That's it. We're just going to bombard them with marketing materials or contact them for that reason. So you have to make an assessment. But you do have this thing called the soft opt-in, and that is where you've either sold a service to someone, or they made an inquiry and there's been like a quotation, a negotiation for a sale. By the way, charity donations does not qualify as a donation, as a sale or a negotiation for a sale. So you can reach out to that customer again, as long as you're reaching out and referring to a related service. And you must also remember to give them the option to opt out at every stage of marketing. So just to point out this opt-out mechanism. So what is it? It's whereby it's the equivalent of an unsubscribe button, if you like. And the idea is that somewhere at the bottom of a marketing, say, email page or whatever, there is some sort of unsubscribe or message to say, if you don't want to receive any further marketing, please let us know. So it's got to be fair, though. You know, you have to be fair to your to your customers. There's no point in offering an opt-out, which can hardly be read because it's in a really obscure place, or it's very difficult to opt out. It shouldn't be that difficult. It should be as simple as clicking one button normally, or one email to a link that's already prepared. Just an example I saw only yesterday on the bottom of of an email, and it was this. The words were this: for us to be GDPR compliant, we would ask you to opt in for us to keep your details in our secure system, or to opt out for us to remove them. So, what if I do nothing? So this is a question for all the group now. So what if I do nothing under this situation? What do you think matters? What holds? Any thoughts?
Well, I thought, I could be wrong, that if you do nothing, you are opting out. I thought you had to take an active step to opt in under GDPR.
Yeah, I mean, this is a company that has already got my details. And for the sake of this discussion, let's say they've been acquired lawfully. You know, I've not been unhappy with the situation, and they're now reaching out to me. So was that it? Was that Ian? Was that you responding there?
No, that was me. That was Jim.
Jim, sorry, you're not on my screen. That's Jim. Right. Yeah. So I can't. You're not on my. I can't see you on my screen at all. So yeah, you're right. Basically, if you do nothing, then because you're being asked to consent back, to reconsent in effect. If you do nothing, you can't take that as consent, which means you're buggered, really. So the question. So my advice is, don't ask the question. If you've got someone's details in your in your CRM, and you've got them lawfully, if you ask the question, is it okay for us to keep them? That is the equivalent of asking to reconsent. If you don't hear back from them, that you can take that as no consent, which means you've got to remove them from your CRM, at least for marketing purposes. So the fact that the question's been asked puts this particular company in a bad place if people don't respond. So in other words, if you don't want to know the answer, don't ask the question. It's important to, and actually this is what happened in 2018. If you remember, there was an avalanche of emails that came around about April time, as companies were concerned about holding people's data, and they were asking it effectively to reconsent or to consent. We've got your details, can we have your consent to hold them? Which is a ridiculous question, isn't it? If you haven't got their consent, why have you got them in the first place? Or they may have those details because they have legitimate interest to hold those details. But as soon as they ask the question, can we have your consent? That trumps the legitimate interest. And so if you don't get an answer, you can't use the mail. You know, and some businesses had to throw away large parts of their marketing material as a result of not understanding the law. Right, emails. If you're doing an email campaign, you look at the screen here. I've got 3 examples of email addresses. They're all fictitious, by the way. So can anybody tell me which bits are personal data based on the 3 emails? So we'll go through them one. Who thinks that the first email under private, philbrown@gmail.com, represents personal data? Everybody? Anybody else? Jamie thinks so, Lorna? Okay. All right. Phil Brown is personal data. You can identify somebody called Phil Brown from that. There may be plenty of Phil Browns in the world, but that's sufficient. Right, corporate address, PA. PA could stand for personal assistant, I suppose. But who thinks that P8 data modeler is personal data? Well, you think it is, Lorna? Okay. Well, in this occasion, it's not, because from that alone, you can't determine who the person is. PA could be my initials. It could be PAR as in father, I suppose, nickname, or it could be PA's personal assistant. So you can't really determine from that information alone that it's personal data. And the bottom one, philbrown@datamodel.co.uk is the business address. Is there any personal data there? There is, because it's Phil Brown. So here's the myth, bust the myth. A business email can contain personal data. Right, so if you go through them now, is the top one, private. In the top one, you've got personal data, so the GDPR applies, and you've got it's a private email address, and PECR will apply. I'm like a consumer in this relationship. I'm not a business, and so I am the subscriber. Phil Brown is the subscriber in this. When you go to the next example, PA@datamodel.co.uk, PECR doesn't apply because it's business to business, and the subscriber is Data Modeler. So the Data Modeler is the legal entity which is being targeted. So PECR doesn't apply in this case, and neither does GDPR because you don't have personal mail, right? Personal data, sorry. And the final one, Phil Brown, a data modeler, the PECR does not apply because it's a business to business, but the GDPR does apply because it includes my name in this case, you know, and I then have rights to opt out or the right to object because in this case, I can or someone can be identified. So it does make a difference what emails you're using and whether or not something applies, PECR applies, or whether it's the GDPR applies, or both apply. Are you keeping up? So there are some other rules in PECR that is, I'm just going to say in passing, and they're preceded by an R number. Automated calls need consent, specific consent. So when you hear those, if you get those accident claims calls, which I get occasionally, you pick up the phone and this is such and such. We hear you've been involved in an accident. This is a robotic voice. This is an automated call. I have not agreed to receiving automated calls from this company. It is therefore unlawful. And even though somebody then comes on, a real person comes on to try and continue the conversation, it's too late. That is an automated call. It's unlawful unless I have given consent. And who in the world gives consent to receiving automated calls for marketing purposes? I don't know anybody. Right, live calls can be consent, or you could do it on the basis of legitimate interest. So interestingly enough, live calls are like cold calling. It is allowed. But if you are going to go down this path, then you need to check the telephone preference service to see whether or not the person you're calling hasn't registered with the TPS in the last 28 days. Because if they have, and you're calling them, that's breaking the law. If you have their consent, even if they're on the TPS, but you have their consent for them to call you, sorry, for you to call them, then that's fine. Because in this case, the consent trumps the TPS. If you're sending text messages or emails and what have you, unsolicited, well, you can't. You need their consent first. Consent implies, therefore, that you know, you've had an exchange beforehand, and so they've agreed to receiving stuff from you. What you can't do is send stuff out to someone with unsolicited emails or texts, you know, without any prior agreement. And if you are doing any of this business, then you must always include the details of who you are, an email address or a telephone number, some form of identification, so the call can be identified when it's being received as well. So there are other rules around PECR, and this is just to emphasize then, in PECR, it's rules-based, so there isn't much wiggle room, whereas the GDPR is based on principles. So when it comes to it, the marketing side of it, business to consumer, is based on both the GDPR, especially from the consent point of view, and the rules-based approach, which you find in PECR. Finally, marketing in a business-to-business sense. And this is probably, actually, I would imagine that most of you, if you're going to do marketing, it will be in a B2B way. So the good news is that PECR doesn't apply by and large. The law isn't designed to stop the flow of business. or the attempt to create business. However, if you are going to sort of effectively cold call another business, you have to sort of do your assessment and like you have a legitimate interest to cold call other businesses. But that doesn't stop your obligation to think about who it is that you're calling. It may be highly inappropriate to call a particular business, depending on the time and the circumstances. So it's not a case of just, look in the other pages, I'm going to call that person or that business. You still have to think about it. And also, I don't know if you know this, but there is something called the corporate TPS, the corporate telephone preference services. So a business can choose to put its details or to subscribe to the corporate TPS and thereby have people be on a list of do not call for marketing purposes as well. Now, I don't know how popular that is, but it is a service. And for very popular businesses, maybe they will use it simply to stop a barrage of speculative calls, perhaps from other businesses. It is a service that's available. And if you if you have a business, a marketing business that's in the business of trying to attract business from other companies, then they need to look at this as well. Because if they are making calls to businesses that are on the C TPS, then it's unlawful. So, it's not quite a clear field when doing business to business. There are some rules as well that you have to consider. And that's it.